So whether in the classroom and what you've seen, what are you learning? What have you learned about how to support kids of color to engage each other? And especially, our audience, I think, and most people doing the sort of, race relational work among children will probably be much more familiar with the white and kids of color framing.
Yeah.
Um, is there something different? And Madeleine, that shift, right, was a key case in point. But is there something, what other things would you add to highlight the difference in how you engage as an educator among kids of color versus a racially mixed group that includes white kids?
That's a great question. Madeline, I so appreciate your answer too. I'm actually going to drop a resource in the chat. If you haven't read Paul Gorski's article about avoiding racial equity detours, it's fantastic. And one of the first things he talks about is, diversity initiatives, multicultural initiatives. Who do they really exist for? Just like you were saying. Because I often do feel like in schools, especially in predominantly white schools, diversity seems to exist to serve white students, to teach them about people who aren't white. And I don't know how many white parents or caregivers ever stop to think, what does my white child have to offer to a student of color, like as a friend, as an ally, like what is my family, my child bringing to this relationship? To go back to the very first question you asked about, what do I think about anti-bias and anti-racism? I think that this is also so important and something that I talk to my students a lot about, that bias is like one of our common denominators, that no one is free from it. And not in a way, that's meant to be super depressing or to make kids like feel down on themselves, but to recognize that based on what we are exposed to, of course, we're forming biases all the time about people who are similar to us and people who are different. Children are incredibly observant. Like we teach them to be observant, to categorize, to sort things like at a very, very young age. So it makes sense that this is the direction that they're going in. And oftentimes, like when we talk about like the definition of racism, because I know that people do define it in different ways. Is it possible for people of color to be racist towards each other? And whether or not you believe that, everyone is certainly capable of holding racial biases and harming other people based on those biases. And so that's the language I usually use when I'm talking to students of color, if they are microaggressing one another or harming each other based on their racial or ethnic backgrounds. So understanding first that bias applies to everyone, therefore anti-bias applies to everyone too. That we do have to be really intentional about how we're thinking about relationship and identity in our classrooms, how explicit we're being there, and how we are really also trying to affirm identity whenever possible. I often talk about how a couple of years ago, if I looked at, even just my classroom library, if I was looking at a book on, slavery or, indigenous genocide or, anti-Asian xenophobia, in terms of representation, sure, I have a lot of different groups centered here, but none of them actually teach my students about the culture, identity, joy, power, contributions, anything positive. And so I thought a lot about what my students are learning about themselves, but also what are they learning about communities and people who are different from them too, because we don't want to just portray everybody as, as the oppressed, even though of course we have experienced oppression, but that doesn't define us. However, when we do highlight these struggles, recognizing that we do have so many similarities, that so many of our experiences are tied together that influence one another. I think one of the most powerful conversations I had with students this year when we were reading the book, Separate is Never Equal. It's about Sylvia Mendez and the fight to desegregate schools in California, was that her family had moved into their farm because the Japanese family that had lived there was sent to an internment camp. And then looking also at their fight in the court, they received so much support from many different communities, from the Black community, the Jewish community, different Asian communities. And those are the stories and the histories that aren't centered. And so how can we bring that intersectional solidarity piece to our classrooms at a really young age, so it becomes common knowledge that people of color have also worked together towards common goals too?
Yeah.